morning and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland's The Full Scottish. There's only really one big topic we're going to discuss today, and that is, surprise, surprise not, the general election. Now, general elections are normally seen as the epitome of the people's choice, except since 2015 there's been a shameless flaunting of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which means general elections are now being held for other reasons. So one of the questions today will be, who stands to gain from this general election? And I don't just mean in terms of seats. Does it make a no deal more likely, as Michael Gove suggested this week? And have those of us who've been pushing for a general election actually been duped? To discuss these questions and many others, I'm joined today by Angus SNP councillor Julie Bell and performer and author Lizzie Eldridge, literally just off the boat from Malta, where she's been living for 12 years. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us,
So my first
Maggie.
question for you both is this general election generally a good idea? Julie?
I don't think it's anything to do with democracy, to be perfectly honest. It's vested interests who'll benefit from this, perhaps, but I think Boris Johnson's hoping that folk are too busy Christmas shopping and it's too cold and miserable and they won't turn out, and he'll get his way.
And it's going to affect the campaigning, surely, for that reason as well. People don't want to go out and chap doors at
Well, I know our team in Angus are out come hell or high water, to be honest, because we're determined we need to get every vote out. So I think the campaigners I've been working with kind of see through that ploy, if you like, and are doing everything they can to burst through it.
So looking at this from a Maltese perspective, where you've been living until very, very recently, what's your view about this general election?
Well, it's funny coming back here because, I was watching Question Time the other night and I said to my dad, we don't have anything like this in Malta. There's no kind of rational, critical discussion in Malta. It's a lot of government propaganda through government-controlled media, because the majority of it is controlled and owned by the government, and there's nothing of this kind of ilk. So even though the problems facing the UK and Scotland are serious, I'm really feeling hugely relieved to be back in a kind of normal society where people can talk normally. In terms of the election, I think Boris Johnson is of another calibre altogether. I think what's going on, there's nothing normal about elections anymore.
No.
There's a whole Russian interference, Facebook interference, Cambridge Analytica interference in the Trump election, in the Brexit election. So I'm thinking there's big powers at play here, which make it a different ball game to whatever we think of as a normal election. It's not a level playing field. And it's really dangerous. I think what surprised me about calling the election is, and the fact that he has encouraged so many of the opposition to demand this election, and SNP are amongst that more than any in some respects. So we got a vague agreement in the withdrawal bill, but we didn't agree on the timetable to debate it. It was too quick, and we needed to go through that withdrawal bill, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, idea by idea, and probably have lots of amendments, and so we end up leaving the EU with something that satisfies more people. Now, by having a general election, effectively that whole process has stopped. If they do manage to form a government on the 13th of December, which isn't necessarily a given, depending on what happens, by the time they get back from their Christmas break, there'll be about 2.5, possibly 3 weeks until the end of January. So actually, we're back in a position where there'll be hardly any time to discuss the withdrawal bill, and it's very likely that Conservatives will form the next government. That's what the polls are certainly suggesting, even though there may be deals to be done. So actually, that's what I mean by being duped. Have we just been taken up this hill suggesting it's all going to be changed, but in actual fact, we're going to end up with a withdrawal bill that nobody wants, or maybe a no deal because they can't agree on something? What do you think?
I'm really concerned about the knock-on effect for the Scottish budget, for example. That's going to be delayed, and it's a tight process already. It takes it to the wire every year, and local authorities are depending on knowing what their funding is going to be. So until all of that process has been gone through, I don't know what arrangements might have been made to speed that up. I doubt that has been even discussed, to be honest.
There would be a budget until the government is decided, and so that could be January. But I'm more concerned about the impact on what's going to happen with Brexit, because there's not a hope I don't think in any regard that the Commission are going to wear another request for another extension because we've run out of time to talk about this. Or, so if Labour do form a government, unlikely as that appears, they've said they will go back to the Commission and discuss a new deal. But that's not going to happen. The Commission are not going to wear this anymore, I don't think. What do people in Malta make of this whole Brexit shenanigans?
We've got so many problems of our own in Malta that it's... I mean, people do speak about it, obviously, and they do comment on it. And I think from afar, or further away anyway, it just does look like a dog's dinner, you know. And some voices are saying, why don't the EU just tell Britain to sling their hook, you know, to just
Well,
leave?
I think that's increasingly the Commission's view,
I
really.
mean, I think the EU have been really patient.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's how many years is this now? 3.5? I mean, it's insane. It's utterly insane. So I think with you know, you get tired of it. With Boris Johnson coming in as an unelected Prime Minister, that's another matter altogether. Prorogue in Parliament. I mean, actually from a distance, I was really pleased because when you know, you saw democratic processes, legal processes at work here preventing him doing that. In Malta, we don't have anything to stop anybody doing anything. That's our problem. So at least here, in comparison, there are still measures in place that say you cannot do that, which means there's some kind of democratic process still at work, whereas in Malta there's not.
Well, actually, this whole idea of democratic process is quite interesting in terms of this general election, because one of the things that concerns me, in this general election, more than any other that I can remember, there are people doing deals and pacts about who will stand in constituencies and who won't. And obviously the big news is that the Lib Dems are forming a pact with the Greens and Plaid Cymru. Does that serve democracy if people don't have people from parties they support standing for election? What do you think?
It's been interesting in my neck of the woods and a bit further afield as well. I mean, as a Democrat, I would support any party standing, and I really think that's for them to decide if they aren't going to put a candidate up, if they take the bigger picture into consideration. But I certainly wouldn't be, you know, chiding any party for not standing. I mean, it's up to us to get our activists and our voters and supporters out, to be honest. But
yeah, but there's been between the SNP and Greens in Scotland, there's a nasty dialogue coming here where people are saying the Greens have no business putting candidates up against the SNP because it might split the independence vote and it might let the Lib Dems in. And that's not democratic.
No, it's
to
not
take
democratic
that view at all. I mean, if I was a Green voter, I might take the view, well, I don't want to vote for anyone else. So what it's actually potentially doing is turning more people off politics. And that's been happening. I mean, the last 3 years of the Brexit shenanigans have actually turned people off against politics. We know that. So you might see a very low turnout for all sorts of reasons. One, it's cold, people are busy Christmas shopping, they don't care. But if you're actually saying we're not going to, we suggest that your party doesn't put up candidates, I think that's fundamentally undemocratic and fundamentally worrying. And I think it's bad, and there's no way to stop it. You can't legislate against that. But I think it's a worrying trend that's happening in this election.
I would agree with you. I don't like that toxic debate either. I think if the Greens had been planning on standing anyone in my constituency, we would have worked really hard to make sure that we got all our votes out. I am aware that there are Green Party supporters who would vote SNP because of the independence question and the importance of returning as many candidates as possible. And I would regard myself as being on the very green end of the SNP spectrum too. There are lots of us there. And we have really good interpersonal relationships with many of the Greens in our area. We have very many shared values and aspirations for an independent Scotland. So I think if we can keep it friendly, people are absolutely entitled to vote who they want to vote for.
Absolutely. But then if they're not able to because candidates are not standing or there are deals being done, then I think that's the worrying thing. The other thing that's worrying about this election, we could call it the Great British Giveaway, because it would appear that the two major parties in the UK, Labour and the Tories, have both agreed to rip up the fiscal rules that have kind of managed the UK really since the late 1970s, and are both talking about borrowing. And actually, I think I'm right in saying when you look at what they're talking about borrowing, it will put Britain's borrowing as a percentage of GDP higher than we've had since the 1970s, which is when it's generally regarded that the economy began to go down the toilet and things got really, really difficult. So we've had a period of austerity. It now seems at a time when the economy is going to be extremely precarious after Brexit, and we don't know actually what's going to happen. Both major parties are saying we're just going to borrow and deal with it. Now, how does that make you feel as people who will be dealing with that?
I think it's terrifying. You know, I think it's terrifying that they're saying these things when, as you say, the situation is so uncertain. So what's the certainty about borrowing? You know, where's that coming from? I think it's pretty terrifying.
Well, the Labour Party have kind of admitted that it will mean an increase in taxes, which that's fine, but it does mean that they'll no longer be able to take the stick to the SNP and claim wrongly that Scotland is the most highly taxed part of the UK because they'll be bringing their tax regime in line. The Conservatives, Javid was on the news talking about negative interest rates, and I was quite intrigued in this. I didn't even know that was a thing, so I went and did a bit of research, and yes, negative interest rates are a thing. Denmark at the moment, I think, is bringing in a negative interest mortgage. So the idea is if you are a borrower, rather than receive any interest, you actually pay the bank to keep your money. Now, usually what banks do is mitigate that by saying, well, we're not going to charge you as a depositor, we will take the hit. But if you're lending, then you are paying no interest whatsoever. In fact, you're being paid to borrow money. It tends to mean that banks' profitability falls, and given that Britain actually owns most of the banks, that means it's affecting us as major investors in the banks. It happened a lot in the 1990s in Japan, and it meant they created things called zombie corporations. So these were businesses that were technically insolvent, should have been allowed to go to the wall, that were propped up to continue affecting productivity, and that all came back to bite Japan about 10, 15 years later. But what worries me about it all is, let's assume the Conservatives do a deal with the banks on a negative interest basis. But you can't trust the banks. 2 years' time, they say, oh, well, we changed our mind, actually, we're going to slap interest rates back on. So it's back to this, we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. But nobody's challenging it. None of the other parties really are challenging that. They're just saying, well, that's their choice. But everybody has put their spending budget out, and not surprisingly, it's the NHS again. So there was a call a week ago not to use the NHS as a kind of punch ball in the election, but in fact, everybody's doing the usual and saying we're going to throw money at the NHS. So the Conservatives have said they'll upgrade 20 hospitals and build 40 new ones. National Audit Committee has said, well, actually, you've planned to build 6. I don't know where the other 34 are coming from. And the Labour Party want to scrap prescription charges, borrowing Scottish National Party policy. Say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So let's talk about the NHS for a while, because I know that's something you're particularly interested in. Jules, you're very involved with the NHS in your part of the country. What do you make of this rather traditional view of let's throw money at the NHS in terms of people and buildings as a way to solve the health crisis in the UK?
Well, it's completely the wrong way round, obviously. I think we need to have a very open debate with our citizens to help them understand that the bricks and mortar of a hospital and the number of hospitals and the number of beds therein do not define high quality healthcare. Okay. From my perspective, we need to see much more money going into the prevention of ill health. We know that poverty is a massive contributor to ill health. If you live in a poor area, you are more likely to experience ill health and a range of long-term conditions. So, for me, it's where is that £1.2 trillion going to be spent? It would be better spent ending poverty, and there's no aspirations that I've seen to tell me that that's what it's going to be spent on.
So that's the 1.2 billion that the Conservative press are claiming the Labour Party are going to spend.
Yes,
Labour Party claim that's a fiction, but that's
yes,
what the Daily Express is saying this morning.
And hospitals and healthcare need to be seen in a much more holistic fashion. So it's a spectrum. We need to make it a well-being service. In Scotland, we've been investing so much more time and effort and resources into the integration of health and social care, keeping people at home for longer, reducing the need for people to be admitted to hospital as inpatients, and reducing the length of their stay so that they can get home.
That that's working?
It's absolutely working.
Okay.
Absolutely working. We've been very much involved in Angus, and I can use that obviously because I sit on the Angus Health and Social Care Partnership, and we've been working over the last 2.5 years around transforming those services and shifting the balance of care so that people are looked after at home and that community services and a wider range of practitioners are involved. You know, who is going to staff those hospitals?
Well, yeah,
that's a massive issue.
Yeah,
especially
as we're no longer going to be able to have the access to European medical staff.
Exactly, and you know, for people to be discussing a reduced cost visa for doctors to come and work in our health service is ridiculous. We've got a system at the moment, being a member of the EU, where we've got free movement and those clinicians can come here. So we're chucking them out with one hand and then saying, well, welcome you from other areas at half price. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and there are real serious issues as well. And the World Health Organization are very strict about this. They have got real rules and protocols on Western countries trying to denude health services in developing countries by bringing medical staff over. It's something they really frown on, and their attitude is it's fine to do it for a very short period, but it should be a revolving door and people should be able to return home, possibly bringing back with them what they've learned if they've been working in a more developed health service. So there's real issues around that. Plus, I think there will be an impact on doctors. The real impact of Brexit and the tighter hostile immigration policy on medicine in the UK is effect on nurses. But at the moment, the amount of money that you have to say you earn to be able to get to live in the UK is way higher than nurses earn. So there would need to be a movement on that as well. And we do know that the nursing, the pressure on nursing is growing, as is the pressure and an even greater pressure on social care. So while I can see that there's certainly in theory and in principle, integrated health and social care works. But if there's less staff in social care, I'm really concerned about that because it's not a profession that young people traditionally want to work in the UK. It tends to be older workers. It's interesting that the Labour Party have announced their major suggestion for the NHS is actually more about the social care element. They want to bring in a national care service. I suppose it's a nice trip off the tongue. I don't know really what that means. But just to get back to your point about what the Scottish Government's doing and its priorities about keeping people at home, do you think, and this is really a question for you, Lizzie, do you think that the public equate that, though, with good health? Or do the public think, actually, good health means more hospitals, newer hospitals, more doctors, more nurses? Do they understand, as the people at the sharp end, that that's what's needed? What do you think?
I wouldn't like to speak on behalf of the general public, but I think probably, when you think of money going into hospitals, that's what you think about, newer hospitals, better equipped hospitals and so on. And the social care thing comes second because from a kind of common sense point of view, you maybe think that's a bit of a fob off. That you're not, you should be in a hospital, whatever, but you're not. So I think there might be a perception that people think, it's, no, I need to be in the hospital, I need to be attended to, I need the nurse 24 hours a day, and that's me getting my treatment. I'm interested because, again, comparing it to Malta, there was a brand new hospital built in Malta Day, not far from where I lived, and it was, celebrated. This is not even 12 years ago, I can't remember the exact date, about 2008, 2007. Already it's hitting huge problems. Malta's a small country, we're talking 450,000 more or less population. Already it's hitting huge problems. They're employing staff from various different countries, some of whom have a problem with English, I actually I teach English as a foreign language, or did do, and I taught a young Romanian woman who was going to be a nurse. You know, and it's really tricky because then people can't communicate with each other, the facilities have gone down, etc. That's a brand new hospital.
Mm-hmm.
What you also see in Malta is a lot of Filipino people being employed as carers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much money they're on, I imagine not a lot. And I find that a little bit worrying as well.
Well, the Philippines are finding it worrying because they just don't have enough staff to manage their own population, and that's why the World Health Organization are really quite strong on this and trying to find other ways to manage.
But this is out with a hospital situation. This is walking in the street. You know, you see people who are obviously working as carers. Yeah, so that's my concern. I think that probably is the right approach, and I think medical experts would tell you that's the right approach. But what worries me is the public don't see it like that. And of course, the general election is about public perception. So once again, we see another policy coming from the Conservative Party, which they just know will chime with their voters, which is let's get lots more policemen on the ground. So 20,000, I think they're suggesting. And at the same time, they're announcing that they want 10,000 additional places for prisoners. Now, most people who work in criminal justice would say, actually, there are too many people in prison, and within a European context, Britain has the highest ratio, and in fact, Scotland particularly. So I know that you've been doing a bit of work with alternative disposals up in Angus, Julie. So what do you think should be the appropriate response that would make the public believe that prison isn't the right answer? Because for a lot of people, lock them up, throw away the key.
Well, that's certainly something that we have to deal with in our wider community. I first got involved in paying a bit more attention to the justice system through Women for Independence, because we were involved in a big campaign to stop a big build for a women's prison. And actually there are a number of projects across the whole of Scotland, but in Angus we have an incredible women's criminal justice service, the Cllr project, that is an alternative to custody, and it is working very closely, through social work in the courts and the police and other services to stop women going to prison, because the knock-on effect is enormous for children, for that woman's long-term health, for local authority funding. So our outcomes are incredibly positive on that. I sit on the local community justice partnership, and problem-solving courts are very much part of that picture in Angus as well. So women who go through the Cllr project, much less likely to reoffend. They're provided social work support, they have access to mental health and substance misuse services. So it's not just a case of saying, right, you have an appointment with that service and expecting women just to get along there when they've got so many things going on in their life. The workers will actually support the women, take them along to appointments to make sure that they actually engage with services. Services come in, they do group work, they support each other, and it's actually incredibly popular service, if you like, so popular that women don't want to leave it once their order has finished, because it's a statutory order.
Are there any similar programmes for men?
Well, that's one of the bees in my bonnet as well. What we've done with the Cllr is extend it to another service where women can self-refer. So there's lots of learning in there that can be replicated for services for men. And there's a lot of research and evidence that shows that gender-specific services do actually work. They work really well. So there is learning to be there. The challenge at the moment is because women are a much smaller demographic within the criminal justice system, it is actually easier to deliver a win for that group, for that vulnerable group.
And also women's pattern of offending is very different.
It is very different. So it's a cost-benefit analysis, if you like. But there is a lot of good work going on with men in the justice system as well. So, for example, things like our unpaid work teams that are actually delivering a lot of benefit to communities throughout Angus, and people are being engaged in that. And interestingly, what that's highlighted for me as well, the number of on Remembrance Sunday, I think it's actually quite important to talk about this. There are a tangible number of veterans in our criminal justice system. And one of the challenges that they have that see them come back into the prison environment again and again is the loss of structure, the loss of that discipline and the loss of that support. And I do see in our prisons in our area, we've got Perth Prison and Castle Huntly, which is part of the open estate. Prisoners are often supported to be released home into their community in a much more structured and supportive way that engages families than quite often veterans are coming out of the armed forces. So I'm very fortunate in that my MSP, Graham Day, has been the Veterans Minister for just a bit over a year now, and we've been able to talk through that and to look at some pilot schemes going on.
I mean, I think I was a prison monitor, an independent prison monitor for about 3 years, and it was in a male prison. So my experience of seeing what happens in male prisons and the pattern of offending and the support or lack of it is fairly up to date. There's no doubt that the prison estate across the United Kingdom is very often used as an alternative to homeless services or drug rehabilitation services or mental health services. And that's not what prisons should be. So just simply suggesting you're going to make 10,000 more prison places available suggests to me that 10,000 more vulnerable people are going to be taken off the streets and put into prison, and that's not helping anybody. What needs to happen is an honest debate about length of sentences, alternative disposals, what we call turning off the tap, which is that there are 3 points at which you could just end up not going to prison. Police don't prosecute, prosecution service doesn't prosecute, or the sentence is, the sheriff decides that the sentence is non-custodial. So again, it's a headline, 10,000 places, but for a lot of people, that's the right thing to do, because there is this idea that people are soft on prisoners, and I think that's a damaging perception. And the thing is, there are not enough people who are aware, really, of what happens in prisons, because we don't go and visit prisons, you might not know prisoners, so there's this other perception. And general elections are about these big, broad brush pictures and really don't dig into
let alone
detail.
the massive contradiction between we're going to increase the police and increase the prison places, and you go, right, okay, how does that work?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it should be reducing the...
Exactly. But it's law and order. The Tory party are the party of law and order.
We need to see much more kindness and compassion in our communities.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I don't imagine for a minute that this general election will result in that. I'm going to stop the chat about general election just because I think we've covered probably enough, and probably half the audience probably switched off by now because nobody's interested in it, and because, not least because we have a guest who's just returned from living and working in Malta. I want to just spend the rest of the programme looking at 2 or 3 big European questions. So this is also the week that is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, as we were just discussing before the programme. So the wall has been down longer than it was up, although obviously there was partition from after the Second World War. What do you think has been the most beneficial thing for the whole of Europe with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, Lizzie? That's a big question.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That's a massive question. I mean, the biggest thing, first and foremost, is for the people of East Germany. I mean, I have a friend who is East German, same age as me, so he grew up, behind the wall, and he tells you all the stories about meeting his aunt at the border and getting chocolate and jeans, and you go, oh my God, it really, really did happen. Although I went to Berlin last year, and there's still a division between East and West Berlin.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really funny.
Absolutely.
And we played a game, are they from East or West Berlin? And you go, okay, huge division. So that in terms of the mentality, it's there, and visually it's there. Financially, I think it's there as well. But to have that was part of the whole wider changes. So you had Glasnost, for better or worse, in terms of what's now happening in Russia. You had Nelson Mandela being freed. You had all of that happening in the space really of a couple of months. So at that period was such an optimistic time. It was a really time for things are going to change. Where we are now, 30 years on, is, I think, pretty scary, sadly. You have the situation in Russia, which is just a total nightmare. You have the Russian interference with the elections, left, right and centre. You have Trump building walls, left, right and centre. You have walls being built. There's an NGO called Sea-Watch who are involved with rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean. You know, they put up a thing yesterday saying there is a wall that's in the Mediterranean and thousands of people are dying behind this wall. And you think, yeah, for all the kind of, without sounding really pessimistic, but, you know, there are real problems facing us now which are tangibly different to the things I think I felt when I was growing up, because the Berlin Wall was part of my, you know, I think I was 21 at the time. And it was all part of your kind of political consciousness going on in your teens, and then this happened. So there was a real sense of joy and like, look what these people are doing and it's brilliant. And you think, okay, maybe older and I don't know, wiser, but more cynical. Not, but, you know, trying to look at it realistically. You know, it's like we keep putting up walls, we keep destroying opportunities instead of creating them. And I feel pretty sad actually looking around at that.
But do you think one of the things that may or may not have fueled some of the Brexit attitudes in this country is that a united Germany fundamentally changed the balance of power in Europe, because Germany became the massive economy that it has been and has had huge amounts of influence. I mean, in all sorts of quite unexpected way. I mean, Angela Merkel's very humanitarian and compassionate response to the migrant crisis, I think, surprised a lot of her own party. It certainly surprised a lot of the opposition in Germany, and it surprised a lot of other European leaders. And she was very determined that Germany had a role to play and it was the right thing to do. But it has, I think, changed the balance of power in Europe. You are now seeing another compact between France and Germany again. And I think that's one of the things that has alienated some people in the United Kingdom about Europe, because actually Britain, who didn't, let's face it, never really wanted to be in the club anyway, but are kind of marginalised. You know, we really are one of the big three in terms of the size of our economy and potential influence, but we've not been. And so I wonder if that will be seen in the future as actually being a good or a bad thing in terms of Europe. Because I think there's no doubt that Brexit will have an impact on Europe in many ways, not least it will force reform. And let's be honest, the European Union needs reform. It's ridiculous, and we'll go on to talk about what's happening in Malta in just a few minutes in terms of its corruption and all the rest of it. But it's ridiculous that there are countries now in the EU who are flagrantly breaching human rights. And Hungary's a classic example. Clearly Spain is, with what's been happening in Catalonia. And the EU is doing nothing about it, saying nothing about it. So if it feels that there needs to be reform. And I recently at a conference in Brussels that was talking just exactly about this. What might Europe look like in the future? Might it be a smaller group of the real Europeans, you know, the original Europeans, with other states saying, well, I want to be kind of part of this bit, but not that bit, a kind of two-tier sort of Europe. What do you think? I mean, from someone who's been sitting in another European country with its own problems, which we will talk about, do you think Europe will reform? Should it reform?
I think it has to reform. I think there's a lot of corruption within European institutions as well. I say that hesitantly because in Malta we need Europe. If we were not in Europe, we would be in a far worse state. The fact that European laws apply and that civil society groups can use these laws to try and stop what's going on, because what we've got basically is totalitarian. Actually.
Well, then is it working then? So
in terms of the European dimension,
yeah.
Well, you had the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, the European Parliament. You have all these Moneyval, all these European bodies putting pressure on Malta, this tiny little lump of rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. The Council of Europe said at the end of June, Malta must have an independent public inquiry into the assassination of the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. And the European Parliament has said... 2 years ago? No, this was in June.
No, but her assassination was 2 years ago.
Yes,
right?
October 16th, 2017.
And nothing has happened since. Okay.
Yeah. Well, lots of things have happened
Yeah,
since, but in terms of finding out who masterminded the assassination, it's still very much
And
in
she,
process.
Panama Papers,
Yes.
is the Panama Papers journalist. So that's it. So the suggestion is there is massive, and people talk about massive corruption in Malta. I think we said to people, most people in this country, Malta, they'd go. The Queen and Prince Philip lived there. They got the George Cross, and you go there on your holidays, right? So that's what
Yeah.
people know about Malta. But there's a lot more going on in Malta. So just quickly, if you can, give us a snapshot of some of the issues that are concerning you about, as you say, this small rock in the Mediterranean of 450,000 people.
Okay, I mean, there's many issues. Try to give a snapshot. So 2013, after over 20 years, a new government came into being called the Labour Party. As I say to my daughter, it's not really anything connected to the Labour Party as we know it here. Cambridge Analytica were in Malta prior to that election. There were all sorts of deals done, and Daphne Caruana Galizia exposed this with such detail and care. You know, since 2008, she kept a blog which was read by thousands of people in Malta, more people than read the newspapers. So you have Henley and Partners, who are connected with Cambridge Analytica, who are selling the passports in Malta, a guy called Christian Cllr. So deals were done in terms of selling passports and people getting backhanders and kickbacks and so on. Panama companies were opened a few days into power. The so-called socialists of the Labour Party were busy ensuring that they had offshore companies in which to place their dirty money. You've had one scandal after another. The assassination in 2017 was horrific. I mean, it changed the entire landscape of the country. Even more horrific was the reaction. Not more horrific, but as horrific was the reaction. She deserved it. She said bad things about people. There was a dehumanisation campaign for the majority of Daphne's life. She was 53 when she was assassinated. There was a dehumanisation campaign that was put in place by the Labour Party that made her into a witch, a monster, a cockroach, very like Hitler. You know, the Jews were vermin, so you can exterminate them. So once you start using that language, you can kill people, and that's what they did. Since she was assassinated, there's been grassroots movements. There's been Occupy Justice, which is a women's-led pressure group that I'm part of. There's an NGO called Republica, which is using democratic processes to take the government to court successfully, and in terms of it keeps going. The government keeps trying to ping back and keeps trying to appeal, but Republica keeps going, and it uses both the Constitution of Malta, the laws of Malta, and Europe, which is why I'm saying Europe is so important, because we have laws that are bigger than Malta, funny enough, the small blinking island in the middle of the Mediterranean. To my mind, I mean, I've just come back, and it took me over a year to think about moving and doing it. That's a long time.
Yeah.
My friends are there, my life is there, many things are there. But physically, one of the things about the whole corrupt system is that the island is covered in cranes. It's covered in cranes, there's drilling everywhere, there's concrete trucks whizzing about these disgraceful roads. So that's the physical and visual manifestation of the corruption. Houses have collapsed because people have been digging close to the house, you know, near a construction site. Houses are collapsing. They're putting up these big towers right beside where I used to work in an English language school.
So
this
you've
big
written
tower.
extensively about this. Are you
Yeah.
concerned that your own personal safety was an issue? As a very vociferous critic of the government and what's been going on?
Occasionally, I mean, what you have in Malta are online, once secret, Facebook hate groups. These were exposed by an independent news portal called the Shift News, which was founded by one of the co-founders, a woman called Caroline Muscat, who's just won the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Prize for Independence. It's hard graft. I mean, you get taken to court, you get sued, you get libel cases, you get death threats, you get harassment. I mean, it's hardcore stuff. It does feel a bit like you're in the middle of a war.
And additional harassment because they're women, because we're seeing
Yes.
this.
Yes.
We're seeing this across journalists across
Yes.
the world, and we're seeing it with women entering politics or public life.
And it's a different kind of harassment,
Exactly.
you know. I mean, with the woman on the once secret Facebook hate groups, which were members included the Prime Minister, and it included the ex-president. The ex-president was a woman, and she said, "Oh, I didn't know." Come on, everybody knows when you join a group because you're asked to join. She cancelled her membership immediately. The Prime Minister took his time. These Facebook groups, you know, they call for critics of the government to be attacked, to be, if you're a woman, raped. You know.
Well, that's the ultimate threat, isn't it? That's the ultimate harassment and violence that can apply to women that can apply to men, but doesn't apply to men as often, sexual violence.
Yeah.
And it's not being called out, it's not being dealt with, it's becoming normalised, and that's terrifying. And it is impacting on women sticking their head above the parapets. I mean, you mentioned earlier that the standard thing, she was called a witch. I mean,
Yes.
God, women have been getting called that for centuries.
Yeah, and I mean,
Like it's a bad thing.
Yeah, like it's a bad thing.
yes, and then you got all the memes, you know, the grotesque memes,
Yeah.
which showed her in really grotesque ways. Occupy Justice, which is a women's-led pressure group that I'm very much part of, we were publicly called by the ex-head of the General Workers' Union in Malta. We were publicly called prostitutes.
My God.
This guy is a government consultant. Was there any kind of comeback? No. I mean,
And
this
is
is
it any wonder
normal.
then that women are much less likely to enter public life in any form, whether it's as a journalist or as a creative person or as a politician?
Yeah.
Is it any wonder? And we know that we're struggling to get women, certainly in this country, and I guess it's probably the same across Europe, to actually engage because of the fear. And I mean, one of the things that astonishes me is that the addresses of publicly elected representatives are made public. And you think, given that we've had in this country people assassinated because of their views as a politician, that's terrifying. And especially in this heightened atmosphere of women being the enemy. It just feels like we're taking masses steps back. That's obviously the agenda, isn't it?
Yeah.
Close us down, shut us up. We've had enough of.
Yeah.
They've had enough
And
say.
it's women as the enemy in a different way. I mean, going back to Malta, it's a highly misogynistic society.
Yeah.
You know, domestic violence is extremely high, and one of the problems with that, I call the police in Malta, but anyway, if I decide, I'll call the police. You know, often they'll turn up and say, "Oh, I know your husband, Joey. How are you doing?" So you've got this problem because it's a small community. You've got a problem that the police are not trained, full stop, to deal with these issues. You've got an extremely misogynistic society. I mean, it's ingrained. It's very South Mediterranean in terms of its outlook. So within all of that, which is why, too, Daphne, not the only reason, but the fact she was a woman made her even more hated.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is the time when we need to double down as women and support each other more to stand, because the wider community, the wider society seeks to benefit from more women being involved in public life.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to keep pushing through this. We can't just cave in and let it happen. And when we see that toxic, misogynist slurs being applied to women who do not share our own political views, we need to stick up for them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's absolutely the
I
case.
agree.
It's just not acceptable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's that thing about what unites us as women is very often more important and of more value in terms of values than what divides us in terms of our own political outlook. We were talking a little bit before the programme started, as we're going to have a quick round of what's been happening in Catalonia, in particular the threats to Carla Ponsati possibly being extradited. I know, Jules, that you were in Catalonia during the referendum, and you talked about the impact of women that were really forefront in the campaign. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, before I'd gone out there, I was quite taken with the number of photographs that I'd seen with older women, very much older women at the forefront of the protests and demonstrations that it happens out there. So once I was there, I actually sought out some women to discuss this with. And these were women who very much remembered what it was like living there under Franco and were determined to be part of the fight to create an independent Catalonia. And I also asked about their engagement with younger people, because I think at that time we were really aware of how important our younger people here are for our own independence campaign, and yet it can be often quite challenging to engage with them. And there had been no specific attempt to engage with young people there. It happened organically.
Okay.
And I think younger people had seen the passion and commitment that the older generations had been engaging in the cause, and they thought they're fighting for our future here. So it's inherent upon us to stand up and be part of that fight for them.
I think that very domestic thing of going out at night and being told you had to bang your saucepans and out the window and things like that.
That was actually wonderful. When we'd arrived in our apartment, the young woman who let us in and to sign all the paperwork, and she said, and when she realised that that's why we were there, she said, you need to go onto your balconies with the pots and pans. And it was very much like the Twilight chorus in 101 Dalmatians, actually. But, you'd go out to your balcony and you'd be very tentative, sort of banging your pots and pans. And then you would hear somebody else pick it up, and then the whole street. And, it was just an incredible energy. And it was a very domesticated, personal campaign.
It reminds me of women in Northern Ireland doing the same around the time of the hunger strikers, going out on the streets with their bin lids and their pots and pans to make a noise.
We did the same recently in Malta as well. There was a mini EU summit where Macron was there, you had like leaders from it was a mini summit. So we were angry that they were even coming to Malta. This was in June, I think.
Okay.
So we found a space beside Castile, which is the Prime Minister's official residence, and we just brought whatever we could, I banged this pot. It made a really loud noise. Yeah. And there was about, 30 or 40 of us behind this police thingy. I mean, it's Malta, everything's smaller. But, and we just banged. And these statesmen standing on the stage, and we're banging and we're chanting. And they had to cut, we were so proud, they had to cut the live Facebook feed, because in the background it's like rah 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 rah. It was a really successful protest,
and
with very basic equipment.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, it's often the women that own these implements. So the fact that women were getting really engaged in that, I think is a lesson for us all. Actually, I think women are actually much more powerful than they think. And I think men, quite often in patriarchal societies, know exactly that. So they have a vested interest in keeping women in their place, which is why we just need to keep pushing through this. As difficult as it might be.
Today's Remembrance Sunday, and irrespective of how you feel about the observance, and there is mixed views about it, it does really bring into sharp focus, I think, being literally maybe 2 or 3 months before we finally do leave the EU, of what peace has meant to Europe, and that peace has been brokered and maintained by the existence of the EU. I mean, that's the whole reason that the coal and steel conglomeration was set up, so that France and Germany wouldn't have to fall out about natural resources and start building armies again. I just wonder whether I listened this morning to some very senior member of the armed forces with an extraordinarily large lanyard around his neck on the Andrew Marr show, talking about the importance of Remembrance Sunday. And he didn't mention that at all, actually. He was all talking about that, we have to remember that the threat, and we've talked a little bit about the threat of Russia and a new world power. And he didn't include the threat from Donald Trump, but I'd seen Donald Trump's as much of a threat to world peace as anybody else. But there was no suggestion, actually, that Europe has maintained that peace. And I wonder just how many veterans who might be marching today in London or across the UK, I wonder how many of them voted to leave the EU, or I wonder how many of them really thought, actually, having been in a theatre of war, and increasingly there's less and less of them still alive, but people who were maybe involved in other conflicts within sort of memory of the Second World War really understand that Europe has maintained that peace and are regretful of what's about to happen. What do you think? Think that's in people's minds today?
I think possibly not as much as we would like. My mum lost her dad through a war-related wound. He died before I was born. My dad did national service, and that was very much part of our family history, sort of being that connected. And very shortly will be the generation closest to the Second World War, and I do think it's incumbent upon us to do what we can to prevent us going that road again. But we still need to remember that there are wars beyond Europe that have been going on, and the role that quite often the UK has played in those wars, and in the context of disaster capitalism and the shock doctrine. People are making money out of wars, so there are vested interests in making sure that they continue to happen, and that deeply, deeply troubles me. My focus is hugely on the outbreak of peace. That would be where my energy goes.
Do you think Remembrance Sunday still has the same importance for people as it once did?
I think I think there are those who are keen to keep it important for very many varied reasons. What we feel about it isn't necessarily a reflection of those who have lost their lives and seen horrific things in various theatres of war across the generations. It's my distress about people being sent on wars that are illegal, for example. I mean, that just breaks my heart. And as a former Samaritan and someone who's worked in mental health, I see all too often people with PTSD from their experiences, and they cannot fit back into what their families would expect them to do. We need to invest so much more in those who are returning.
The amount of homelessness amongst veterans
absolutely, and we touched on that earlier.
We talked about the impact and their engagement with criminal justice. Obviously, Malta's, famous plucky little Malta won was it the George Cross? It won, yes.
Yeah.
Is that something that's part of the kind of fabric of life in Malta? Is this a big day, Remembrance Sunday? Do people really?
Not particularly, not as far as I can remember. More important for them is Victory Day, which is in September. Let me get this right, which is remembrance of the Great Siege, which was 1565 when Malta proudly fought off the Turks.
Okay.
The reason I'm being a bit sarcastic is because there's the monument, which is where we're carrying out our protest. It's a protest in front of the law courts at this monument where we place flowers and candles and pictures. Every night it's cleared away by the government, and the government say, this is like a public monument is celebrating, our great victory over the Turks and hundreds of years ago. So that's seen as more important.
So you lay everything, and every day it gets cleared away, and you go back and do it again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who's going to blink first?
It's quite incredible. I mean, it's been cleared probably nearly 600 times now, but by the government on state orders, by the Orwellian Cleansing Services Department.
Okay, that's what they're called.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, just going back to Catalonia briefly, because that's on state orders. Obviously, we've seen the quite unprecedented demonstrations in Catalonia of recent times, and also the unprecedented handing down of these punitive jail sentences for people who were undertaking their democratic right. It's been brought back home to Scotland again. Carla Ponsati has had yet another international arrest warrant issued against her. I understand she should have been in court this week, but the arrest warrant was sent back deemed to be incompetent and full of all sorts of contradictions. But I think she may be in court next week. Now, the Scottish courts have already rejected this once. I've no idea why Spain think that will change. It may do. I have no knowledge really what's happening within the campaign. Did you have any update on on that, or what's likely to happen?
I don't. I can't talk with any authority on that at all. But what we talked briefly about the role of the EU and not being vocal enough in terms of calling Spain to account around this. And I have spoken to a friend of mine in Catalonia around the role of the EU, and they are disappointed that the EU hasn't stepped up to the plate. And it's part of it's not perfect, but we'd still rather be part of it. And the mantra about not interfering in a member state's internal matters,
which was proved to be false.
Exactly. But the feeling is that the EU is still something of value for Catalonia, and they would want to be part of that, is my understanding. Would like to see them be more vocal around Spain, the Spanish government's behaviour towards them, which is brutal.
Well, I think if Spain are breaching human rights, and it seems that, and I'm certainly not a human rights lawyer, and I'm not really a human rights expert, it tinge a bit of the work that I do, but I would have thought there was grounds for them to at least comment on that. But then the same could be said surely of Malta. And they're not doing that either. So
well, they are and they aren't.
Okay.
I mean, again, it's that. It's the powers the EU have and European bodies have to enforce. I mean, the European Parliament, for example, said Malta's cash for passport scheme must be terminated. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's pretty categorical. No.
Oh, it hasn't been?
Of course not.
All right, so, well, there you go. So they said it, but nothing's happened.
But they said it, and you go, okay, how do you then enforce it?
Okay.
Some of the MEPs, there's a great woman, Roberta Metsola, Maltese MEP, and she keeps campaigning for this. But as yet, you're absolutely right, nothing's happened. To hear the EU say this is fantastic, because then you can go, it's got to be terminated. But again, it's like the same with the independent public inquiry into the assassination. The deadline came up. The government, 6 days before the deadline, went, here we are, here's our 3 guys that we're putting up to lead it. And, one look at them and you said, they're all connected to the government. Mm-hmm. So the Council of Europe said, absolutely not. So now we're about 46 days past the deadline for this public inquiry, and the campaign has started up again. We're now 46 days past it. We need an independent public inquiry. The powers of the Council of Europe, I'm not sure what they are, because I'm not an expert in this either. I think they do have certain powers.
They do, yes.
But how far?
But how much it's a long time in international law that I don't know.
Yeah. And it's funny because listening, to Catalonia as well, it seems there's a lot of places in dire need of an EU that will step in and help.
Yes. So you said that Malta needs the EU. Without it and without that, those legal protections which you do have access to, whether or not they're being implemented or not, Malta would be in a worse position. So it does seem that there is one member state who is crying out for that support and guidance to make Malta an effectively non-corrupt functioning democracy, and yet the EU don't seem to be able to make that happen.
Well, the trouble is the people who are crying out are in a minority.
Yeah. Oh, really? So it's not...
the government is hugely popular.
Oh, really?
Yes, and we're talking a populist dictatorship, I would describe it as.
Right.
They won by a sweeping majority after the Panama Papers, after gross allegations of corruption at the highest level. They won.
It's like it's happening in this country. It doesn't matter what Boris Johnson's Conservative Party do. Yeah. They are still ahead in the polls, despite the fact that you would think everything, including, being found to have broken the law and proroguing Parliament. I personally have no interest whether he lied to the Queen or not. It's a minor interest to me, but he did it, and apparently that's a bad thing. But despite all of that,
and despite the fact he's quite the last person you would ever want at your dinner table, let alone to be the blinking Prime Minister.
Absolutely. So, what does this tell us about the? What does this tell us about democracy? What does it tell us about power? What does it tell us about people's real understanding of any issues? I mean, one of the things that seems to be happening. And we have to finish soon. But one of the things that seems to be happening is that the idea of people voting or working or thinking about the common good is a thing of the past, and really people are increasingly looking at how is this going to affect me. And that's certainly what happened within Brexit. It was also the reason so many people of a certain age in Scotland voted no in the independence referendum. It's what's it going to mean to me and my family. And the more that we are put into difficult positions, that's going to happen more in all of these issues of the common good, and what's best for the compassionate society that you were talking about just isn't going to happen. We have to finish, I'm afraid. That's been an absolutely terrific programme. I think we should always aim to have somebody on the panel who's recently returned from Europe, because I think that view has been extraordinarily helpful. I've certainly learned a lot more about Malta than I knew before. I knew a little bit, and I'm determined to read more. And I see you've got your books with you there, so I'll have a look at one of these at the end of the programme. So that's it for another week. I hope you've enjoyed it. As we always say, making programmes is expensive, and in order for Broadcasting Scotland to continue, and there'll be an even bigger need for us to continue over the coming weeks in the run-up to the general election, do think about contributing, do think about joining any crowdfunding, and do keep watching and telling your friends to watch too, because we really do have the best guests of any news programme on a Sunday. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. My fellow guests, thank you very much indeed. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you, and good morning.